Okay, right. So hello again. So this is my fairly bog standard three bed ex-council semi. It has got cavity wall insulation. It has got, a good 300, 400 mil of insulation in the loft. It has got double glazing. I have insulated underneath the timber floors in the living room, but it's by no means a super home. There was some side. Oh, why is that? Right. Has that moved on?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So built in the 1930s, when it was built, it would have been absolutely freezing and carbon emissions, maybe 12 tons a year. Very uncomfortable. I've been here, well, getting on for 30 years now. And I've upgraded it gradually and brought the heat loss down. So I used around 16,000 kilowatt hours of gas the first year I was here. I fitted a wood stove. I did the cavity walls, so I got it round to about 12,000. And then about 10 years ago, or probably more than that now, 12 years ago, I added the PV system and a condensing gas boiler. Got the gas use down to 8,000 kilowatt hours a year and electricity use down to 1,500. So my carbon emissions are down to about 2 tons a year as against the 12 tons, which we estimate originally. And that's not allowing for export of electricity to the grid. But then 3 years ago, can be 4 years, I decided to fit an air source heat pump. My gas boiler was coming up for needing, it was only 10 years old, but it was proving quite difficult to keep it maintained. And I thought, well, I'm talking to people about reducing their carbon emissions. I really ought to try one of these air source heat pumps and see what it did. I found an installer recommended by a friend, MJS of Pristine. I told them I only wanted it to do the heating. That's no longer possible if you get the boiler upgrade grant. If you go for the boiler upgrade grant, it's got to do the hot water as well. But mine doesn't. Mine just does heating. They calculated I needed a 7 kilowatt heat pump and recommended fitting some larger radiators and a buffer tank. To get the grant, you have to fit a heat pump large enough to heat the house. So one of the problems with properties that are less well insulated is the heat loss calculation will be high. You will need to fit a larger heat pump, even if you only want to use the heat pump for sort of background heat. But replacing the radiators is up to you. So we changed all the single panel radiators in the house to double ones, except in the two rooms we use as bedrooms, which we don't really heat. I mean, you know, I left those as they were. So this is the air source heat pump. We didn't consider ground source. Basically, it would have been as I think it's Richard mentioned, two or three times the price. We don't have a large garden, so it would have to have been a borehole. So we went the simple route and got an LG Therma output. And the 7 kilowatt is output. So if it's running at a coefficient of performance of 3, as Richard mentioned, you'd be putting about 2.5 kilowatts of electricity in. There is a buffer tank in the bathroom. This helps reduce some of the strain on the heat pump and gives us supply of heat for defrosting. But apparently, things have moved on in the last 4 years, and they're quite rare these days. Most installers do not advise fitting a buffer tank. We do have weather compensation control, so the flow temperature, the temperature of the water going around the radiators does go up and down depending on the outside temperature. That's almost essential. But you also need to set what your maximum figure is for your flow temperature, and ours is set to 45 degrees. But if it does get cold and the heating isn't, it's not hot enough, I can always go in there and raise that by a few degrees. But the higher the flow temperature, the less efficient the system is going to be. So the one time the weather compensation fails a bit is on really windy days because it's only taking regard to the air temperature. But if you've got a really windy day, you get more wind chill, but you also get a higher ventilation rate. So really, on a really windy day, you need more heat. So that's when you might go in there and up that from 45 to 47 or even 50 degrees. And the hot water is done by this little nifty under sink unit, an electric shower. Um, yeah, if you want the heat pump to do hot water as well, then you have to have a hot water cylinder, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't want it to do the hot water, because I'd taken my hot water cylinder out because I'd fitted a combi boiler back in 2011. I didn't want to put it back in again. So, and um, if you are going to have a hot water tank, then the heat pump is best set to keep your hot water tank at 50 degrees most of the time, with just a boost once a week or so to 60 degrees to have a check on Legionnaire's disease. So the house is very comfortable. We keep the hallway to 18 degrees during the day, 16 degrees at night. The living room is generally around 2 degrees warmer than this during the day. So the house never gets too cold and the heat pump rarely has to work hard. We do have a wood stove. Actually, it says rarely. I don't think we've lit the wood stove since we fitted the heat pump. So and it's out, actually it's covered with plants. So if I did want to light it, it'd take me a few hours to clear the space and get the wood in and do a very, very occasionally, we might use a fan heater first thing in the morning after getting out the shower, just as the house is warming up after cooling down from the night before. So the heat pump is providing, 99% of our heat requirement. Now, what I've done, I haven't got the fancy monitoring that Richard has. Mine doesn't have a heat meter on it. I can monitor how much electricity it uses, but not the heat it puts out. So I've been taking my readings on a weekly basis, and this was the electricity that the heat pump used in its first year. And you can see that I presume you can see my cursor, but a lot of the time it's either not in use or it's ticking over. It's using very little electricity. There's a few weeks when it's using a medium amount, and then there's 8 weeks in that first year when the usage did go a bit higher. Those 8 weeks accounted for nearly 48% of the energy use of the heat pump. I also measure my electricity generation, my PV export and use. So even with the heat pump, I'm still exporting roughly 70% of what I generate. I reckon the PV is providing about 15% of the electricity I need for the heat pump, because the timings aren't really very good. The PV is working hardest in the summer, and even if it is working in the winter, it's not generally working first thing in the morning when the heat pump's working the hardest. Yeah, the economics, it cost me about 10,000 to fit. That included replacing some of the radiators and fitting the buffer tank. I should get about 6,000 back through the RHI. Oh, that's out of date now. The new grant scheme is now 7,500, and that gives it to you up front. So actually, for people with smaller houses, the boiler upgrade scheme is a better deal than the RHI. If you had a very large property, the RHI was better because it was done on your heat demand. So it cost me about 4K maybe. But I saved 3K on the cost of replacing the gas boiler. The running costs, the maintenance repair costs are a bit lower. I'm paying £200 a year to maintain the heat pump. It was actually costing me 300 a year for my gas boiler with British Gas. Fuel cost, I reckon at the moment is similar, but if the price gap between electricity and gas narrows as it expects, I think in future years it might be cheaper. So it should become a cheaper option in the future. But that's not why I did it. I did it to save carbon, really. And I've also plotted the heat pump usage against degree days. I don't know how many of you in the audience like a graph, but anyway, here's a graph. So this is the bottom line is the kilowatt hours used by the heat pump in a week, and the vertical column is the degree days in a week. So you can there's a website, you can look it up, you can find for your area how much heat you should really have needed in a particular week, and then I can plot that against my actual usage, and you can see that the line is pretty good. It's pretty good. There are some weeks up here where I'm using a bit more electricity than would be suggested by the yeah, the points below the line are showing increased electricity. I did actually have there was a period when next door wasn't occupied, and I think these higher weeks were when there was nobody next door. But generally, it's a pretty good line. It's what's known as a power curve. If the efficiency of the heat pump was the same regardless of the outside temperature, then that would be a straight line. But this is showing it's a curve. So it is showing that as it gets colder, you need more, you need to put more for an extra 10-degree D days in a week, you need to add significantly more electricity to drive the system, which is what we'd expect. I did the same for the second year, and actually the highest heat use in the first year was under 200 kilowatt hours in a week. In the second year, there were 4 weeks, 4 really cold weeks, when the electricity use did rise, and there was 1 week when it was a eye-watering 340 kilowatt hours in a week. The important thing is not to look at that week, but to look at the overall efficiency over the year. So even in that year when we had those 4 really cold weeks, the system used 3,576 kilowatt hours of electricity. Electricity at about 25p a kilowatt hour. So we're looking at about £800 for my heating, which I think is this day and age that's very reasonable. And the point where a ground source heat pump would win out, it was if we got a beast from the east that lasted for 3 months, then a ground source system would definitely start paying its way. But under our normal conditions, an air source heat pump is perfectly acceptable. This is just the details of where you can find out your degree days if you're interested in going that far. We've also disconnected the gas fire, fitted an induction hob, and removed the gas meter, so we save £160 a year in standing charges. It's also I think it's undoubtedly improved the indoor air quality. We worry about poisoning from gas boilers, but we merrily cook on a gas stove with no ventilation at all. So I'm sure it's a good way to go. The heat pump does what we ask of it. There's occasional evenings, particularly when it's windy or when I'm tired, particularly tired, when a larger radiator in the living room would be useful. I do need to take out the old gas fire to reduce ventilation losses in high winds. The heat pump makes very little noise, except in the really coldest weather. But in the really cold weather, our neighbours aren't outside enjoying a glass of prosecco on the patio, so they seem to be okay with it. But do be careful where you site the circulation pump. No, this is the pump that's sending the water around your radiator systems, because it will come on in cold nights to keep the house up to temperature. So if that's in a bedroom, that could be disturbing. And I've had people complaining about the noise of heat pumps, and it's not the heat pump itself that's creating the noise; it's the circulation pump from the radiator system. But one thing we do find is that if the heating does come on at night, it used to creak a lot because the flow temperature was higher. The pipes would be expanding in the timbers under the floor, and it would creak, and it doesn't do that anymore because of lower flow temperature. Our carbon emissions are down now to 660 kilograms an annum and falling, because of course we're reliant on grid electricity. So That's not allowing for our green electricity supply or our export of electricity from the PV system. We're only paying one standing charge, and the EPC rating is C78. So that's our carbon emissions, how they've dropped since I bought the property. And I just want to mention very quickly, I'm also working on a thing called the Bishop's Castle Heat and Wind Project. If you're interested, look up the Lightfoot Enterprises website. There's some details on that. There, we're actually fitting a very large heat pump. Well, we're planning to fit a very large heat pump to heat the leisure centre, the school, and around 100 houses. And we're gonna fit a 1 megawatt wind turbine and 500 kilowatts of PV to power the heat pumps. And the planning application for the wind turbine was submitted today. Okay, any questions?